What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 286 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today is Friday the 13th. Woo! So I thought it would be appropriate for me to talk about Dr. 13, Architecture and Mortality, by Brian Azzarello and Cliff Chiang. You may recognize that creative team. Later on, they worked on the Wonder Woman reboot from the DC New 52 about 5-ish years ago. And this is from an 8-issue miniseries called Tales of the Unexpected. These stories were backup features in that miniseries. I believe the feature of that strip was The Spectre, if I'm not mistaken, although I could be mistaken. But these are all reasonably short stories. They're not full-length 22-page issues. And basically the premise is Dr. 13, he and his daughter go to the French Alps to investigate a plane crash where all of the survivors were apparently eaten. And then every issue, things just escalate more and more. If you're unfamiliar with the character of Dr. 13, he is a skeptic who doesn't believe in any of the weird paranormal stuff, doesn't believe in ghosts, vampires, yetis, anything like that. And so he's a lot like Scully from the X-Files, and if you know anything about me, you know that I absolutely detest the X-Files. I think that it was just a horrible, wretched television show, and so you might be thinking that I really don't like Dr. 13 and then I didn't like this book, but you would be mistaken. I don't really have any strong feelings on Dr. 13 one way or another. Most of the time, I've only ever seen him show up as a guest star in various comic books. I seem to recall he showed up in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing at one point, I think, and I believe he showed up in one of the Flashpoint tie-ins, but other than that, I don't really see him show up that often. I know he was a pretty big thing back in the 60s. I think he shared a comic with the Phantom Stranger, but he's kind of one of those characters who worked a lot more back in the 60s and, well, the early 60s when superheroes were not a sure thing. You had characters like the Challengers of the Unknown or the Sea Devils or Dr. 13 who were not exactly superheroes because at that time they were thinking superheroes were just a fad and they were going to disappear, and whenever superheroes stopped being popular, then they would already have these other characters who are still adventure heroes, but they're not exactly superheroes that they could fall back on. And then superheroes became huge, and they never really went away in comic books, and so characters like the Challengers of the Unknown, or Cave Carson, or Dr. 13, they never really took off in the same way that characters like the Flash and Green Lantern did. But this is bringing back this character, and I really think that this particular story could not have been done with any other character. Dr. 13 is the best kind of character to do this kind of weird, pseudo-metatextual examination of superhero comics, specifically from DC Comics. There are two different ways that you can enjoy this book, and you can enjoy it in both ways simultaneously. On the one hand, you can enjoy this as the extraordinarily, very silly, very goofy, hilarious superhero romp that it is. In each issue, things escalate, things get more weird, more crazy, and more bizarre. At one point, Dr. 13's daughter is kidnapped by Nazi guerrillas. Then there is this phantom pirate who shows up, and then we get a Civil War veteran who is also a ghost. We have Vampire, Andrew Bennett. He shows up. Things just get weirder and weirder with each issue, and Azzarello and Chiang know how to just keep the adrenaline running. They don't ever stop to pump the brakes and say, okay, let's slow things down a little bit. And I think that when you're doing a weird, wacky, almost farcical adventure story like this, that is a wise move to make. The other way that you could enjoy this is the way that it kind of examines how superhero stories are done. It shows you a little bit of how the sausage is made, if you will, at DC Comics. The big thing is, from the very beginning of the issue, I think the very first page of this story shows, I believe his name is Anthro. It's this caveman guy right here. He is writing on the wall in French, modern French. He is writing something, I think it says, "Beware the Architects," and it turns out that the Architects are some actual writers at DC Comics. It is Mark Waid, Grant Morrison, I believe Jeff Johns, and Greg Rucka, and they were the four writers who wrote the weekly series 52. And basically this is saying that those four guys are the gods of the DC Universe, and that they are in control of the DC Universe. And of course, Dr. 13 is a skeptic. He doesn't believe in anything like that, doesn't believe in heaven or hell or the human soul. And so all of this is one big, basically hallucinatory nightmare for him. And you get to see him slowly just accept that all this weird stuff is going on, in the same way that Morrison's Animal Man went. If you've never read Morrison's Animal Man, you might want to plug your ears for a minute whenever I put my thumb down down, I will stop spoiling Animal Man. So anyway, in Grant Morrison's Animal Man actually met Grant Morrison, and the whole series ended with these two having this really long conversation about the relationship between reality and fiction. And it's kind of doing the same thing here. Okay, I'm done spoiling Animal Man. We're kind of getting the same thing going on here with this relationship between these two things. I don't know if it's handled as well. I think if you were going to do something like that, I would have preferred that this had been a little bit longer. It's not a very long story. I would have preferred that we could have gotten a couple of more chapters to explore this dichotomy, while also maybe getting a better chance to explore some of the character dynamics that we get here. We get some really good character dynamics. Some of the characters who were introduced earlier in this miniseries, they get more of a chance to shine than some of the ones who were introduced later on. For example, Infectious Lass from the Legion of Substitute Heroes, she is in this book. She doesn't get to do nearly as much as, say, Andrew Bennett, who's introduced in like the second issue, I think, or at the very end of the first issue. So some of these characters, they get to do a lot more than some of the others. But I think if this had been just a little longer, we could have seen them interact a little bit more. We could have seen some of these characters go along their character arc in a little bit more of a smooth transition. For example, the Nazi gorilla, or I don't know if he's a gorilla. He calls himself an ape at one point. He's kind of a fun character. We get to see him go down a character path that I didn't really see coming whenever he's first introduced in this story. But I really think if this book had been just a little bit longer, we could have seen the thesis of this whole story be explored a little bit more, and also the story itself could have had a little bit more room to breathe. As is, I love this book. This is one of the most entertaining comic books that I've ever read. It's a little dated because the architects here are people who aren't really working at DC Comics anymore. Jeff Johns is working with DC, but is he really the architect of the DC Universe? He's more involved with the TV and movie stuff than he is with the comics at the moment, so I wouldn't really put him as one of the architects of the comic universe. Greg Rucka, I have no idea what he's doing right now. Last I heard, he was writing Wonder Woman, but that's one title out of however many that DC has. I don't really think that he is one of the 4 people in control of the DC Universe. And then you have Grant Morrison, who's not writing anything in DC right now, and Mark Waid, who is a freelance writer, but I don't think he's doing anything for DC at the moment. So that's one thing that's a little weird about this, although technically you could read this and you could say that the architects are anybody who's working at DC, because they're not actually named. You don't actually see them say, I'm Grant Morrison and I'm Mark Waid. But when you look at them, if you know what Grant Morrison looks like, if you know what Jeff Johns looks like, then you can kind of figure out, okay, even though these guys are all wearing these plastic Batman masks, that's very clearly Grant Morrison based on the striped suit that he's wearing, and so these other guys are probably Rucka, Johns, and Waid. But anyway, if you don't know what those guys look like, then maybe it's not as dated as what I was thinking. But reading this, I was thinking this was probably a lot more topical and a lot more, I don't want to say relevant, but a lot more topical when it first came out than it is now. But I still enjoy this book a heck of a lot. It is one of the most entertaining comics I've ever read. I think that you guys should definitely check it out. It's a very fun story. Even if you're not into that whole metatextual thing, I think you'll still enjoy it. So those are my thoughts on Dr. 13, Architecture, and Mortality. I hope that you guys liked this review, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.